So, oh, okay. Can you hear me? So, I wanted to talk to two issues that have come up. One is the question of the scope and the reach of this problem in the country and what it will take to resolve it in a way in which we think it ought to be resolved. And I think it's important that we understand that we've been a couple hundred years creating this problem, right? It isn't something that just happened overnight. And it's something that the nation created as a whole. It didn't get created in small pockets of the nation. The whole country helped to create it. There is one place in print that I have read where the problem is kind of laid out in a couple of sentences, and it's in a little book called Slums and Suburbs. It was published in June of 1961, and the author is James Bryan Conant. Now, Conant was the president of Harvard from 1933 to 1953. Conant was the person who gave us the SAT, and he gave it to us first so that public school students could get a chance to go to Harvard in the 1930s. And then after World War II, he sat as the first chairman of the board of ETS, the Educational Testing Service, which set up the process for the whole country for its national exam about the SAT and who gets into colleges and universities. But he went and took a look at the schools in the late 1950s, and he identified schools as either suburban schools or slum schools. He has this sentence in the book. He says that the nation agreed after the Civil War to establish a caste system for the freed slaves and their descendants. What he was astonished about was that the clearest manifestation of the nation's caste system is its educational system. So we have been running an educational system since the end of the Civil War, which really is a manifestation of a caste system. Now, I ran into it in the Mississippi Delta in June of 1963. I was on the witness stand in the Federal District Court in Greenville. Out in the courtroom were sharecroppers from Greenwood and LaFleur County, wall to wall. They were standing around the walls and packed on the benches. What did the federal district judge want to know from me? He wanted to know, why is SNCC taking illiterate people down to register to vote? So the subtext of the right to vote was education, because Mississippi had a literacy test, and they wanted to control who and who could not vote based on the literacy test. So basically, what was our answer? Well, the country can't have its cake and eat it too. It can't have denied a whole people access to literacy through its political arrangements, and then turn around and deny them access to politics because they're illiterate. Right? So if you go back and look at the argument of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department before the Senate Judiciary Committee around the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? The key argument there is the decision by Judge Wisdom from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals around the case U.S. versus Louisiana, because the Justice Department filed two cases, U.S. versus Louisiana and U.S. versus Mississippi, looking at the history of education of black people and white people in those states as the basis for saying that you can't use a literacy test to say who can and who cannot vote. So there is no literacy requirement in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now you're dealing there with the 15th Amendment, and the subtext for it is the 14th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment is saying that people have the right to vote, but in order to enforce that, you had to go into the issue of what are the substantive rights of citizens? Do they have a right to an education? And if they do, then you can't use the literacy test when you have deprived them of that right for 100 years as a basis for saying they can't vote, right? So this is the issue that faces the country now. As a country, right, that as a country, we have said that there are people in our country, first, who are slaves and should not be educated, and then after slavery we got Jim Crow, and so we have a system where they get what I think of as sharecropper education, right? And what you have to look at is 1944 on the Hobson plantation outside of Clarksdale, the first machines picked a row of cotton, right, a field of cotton. And Richard Hobson was the plantation manager, and he sent a famous letter to all the plantation owners in the Mississippi Delta saying they should mechanize the picking of cotton as rapidly as possible to alleviate the Negro problem. And from 1944 to 1970, 5 million sharecroppers were refugeed into every urban area of this country. What went with them was sharecropper education. That's what Conant saw in the late 1950s and put it in that book, right? And so we've got to eliminate that, but it's not going to happen piecemeal. Yes, piecemeal, everybody has something to do, but it has to be raised up to the level of the Constitution, the President, the Congress, the Supreme Court. We've got to decide as a country that we are, for the first time in our history, going to look at all the children in the country as children of the country, and that we are going to see to it that they have a quality public school education.